Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Carrie Anderson, production editor for the Texas National Security Review. What follows is a presentation by Ramon Pacheco Pardo, who provides a comprehensive view of South Korea's approach toward alliances, strategy, and security. Let's listen in.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here, and it's funny because when I told my friends I'm from Spain, when I told my friends I'm coming here to Texas, I said, "Oh, Texas is like Spain. People are very nice." And I landed here, people are so nice. It's like I'm back home, everybody speaks Spanish and everybody's nice. So it's a real pleasure to be here, actually. So Sheena, thank you very much for the introduction. As she was mentioning, this book came out last year. And this one is specifically on South Korea's grand strategy. It came out, you and I have been working on Korean stuff for many years already, right? And it's true that most of the literature focuses on North Korea. And when it focuses on South Korea, normally it's more about domestic politics. I'm talking about academic literature, or as you were saying, maybe now culture has become very popular, of course. But in my view, there was no book that covered this long-term strategy that Korea may have when it comes to relations with other countries, not only the alliance with the US or China, but the book really covers the whole world. And I thought, well, I think it's a topic that deserves attention. And interestingly, when I started the book, the research spans many years, but when I actually sat down and started to write the book, it was shortly after the pandemic. And we noticed in Europe, as you were saying, I have a couple of affiliations in London, but also in Brussels. We noticed in Europe that policymakers were making more and more questions about what to do with Korea beyond the Korean Peninsula, right? Many questions about, obviously not only because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which for us in Europe is central to how we see global politics, but also what is Korea's position in Northeast Asia, in Southeast Asia? How does the alliance with the US work? How can Europe benefit from working with the alliance as well? What does Korea think about China? How can we work with Korea about China? So interestingly, I noticed that by the time the book came out, it wasn't only scholars that were interested in these topics, but policymakers as well, because they wanted to see what was possible to do with Korea. And in the talk today, I'm going to focus on the argument that I make in the book, but I will introduce these points that I'm making about, at least from the perspective of Europe, why we do have to pay attention to this matter. This may come more natural to you because the US has the alliance, and obviously the US has a presence in Northeast Asia, but Europe doesn't, right? And that's something I cover in the book, the regions that are not Northeast Asia and the topics that are not the alliance with the United States. So I'll start with a couple of more theoretical points, but I'll be brief with them. I don't like theory myself, even though I'm a scholar, but I'll make them. The first point that I make is that if you look at the literature on grand strategy, for good reason, most of it focuses on the US and more recently on China, right? Superpowers, their interests span the globe. They have the resources to shape, not even to influence, but actually to shape global politics. But if you look at a country such as Korea, that's not necessarily how we would think about it, right? In my case, I live in the UK. I spend my time in the UK and Brussels. And it's very interesting because in the UK, there are those who think, oh, the UK is actually a great power, but most recognize, no, it has become now a middle power, right? But in Korea, they do know that they're a middle power and that's how they define themselves. So they think about, okay, how can we influence global affairs and how can we be autonomous in our grand strategy, which explains the subtitle, right? Making its own destiny. Because I noticed this parallels between different middle powers that we want to be able to be autonomous from this great power competition between the US and China, which I will explain in the case of Korea means working with the US, right? It means working with the US not only in the Korean Peninsula, but beyond the Korean Peninsula. But it also means having the option, in some instances, right, to try to pursue your own goals. And second theoretical point is grand strategy is meant to be long-term, right? Now, in the case of democracies, there's a question. Every 4 years, every 5 years, we have elections. The president, prime minister may change. Can we actually have a grand strategy that spans different presidencies? And I make the case that in the case of Korea, this is certainly true, right? That yes, you have liberals, you have conservatives, they're divided when it comes to domestic politics, but when it comes to grand strategy items or security policy, foreign policy, there are necessarily big differences when it comes to the goals you pursue and the tools to use, right? So this is the couple of theoretical points that I wanted to make, but I want to dig into Korea itself. Now, the book is based on interviews that I conducted over many, many years. Actually, the first set of interviews go back to 2008, 2009, when I was doing my PhD, and I had the chance to talk to many Korean officials. I was based in Korea back then, and then from the years 2020, 21, more or less, 2022, 23, right? So I conducted these two set of interviews, which allowed me to talk to policymakers who had been serving in every single administration since Korea became a democracy in 1988. Obviously, 2008, 2009, I focused more on the policymakers who had been serving in the 1990s all the way until then, and then I updated this with policymakers from 2008-9 onwards. Plus foreign diplomats, security officials that had been interacting with Korea, mainly from the US, as you can imagine, but also from other countries, from Europe, Southeast Asia, Japan, China, as much as it was possible. I did it as well, to get a picture about how policymakers and those interacting with Korea, how they felt about Korea's long-term grand strategy, supplemented with white papers, speeches by presidents, all the way from 1988 until 2023, really, which is December 2022 is the ending point of the book. And I noticed a pattern, regardless of whether the president was liberal or conservative, and regardless of the time period, that allowed me to say, okay, yeah, there is a grand strategy. And what are the key drivers behind the grand strategy? That's the first point that I'm going to make. First of all, Korea is in a region that is very complex. You have China, you have Japan, obviously you have the US presence as well, right? You have potential conflicts in the Taiwan Strait, obviously North Korea, South Korea, but you have great power rivalry playing in the region. And something that Korean officials going all the way back to 1988, and you also saw this in documents issued by the Korean government, they wanted to have an independent voice in this very volatile region, right? In Western Europe, until Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we thought that, yes, great power competition matters, but it's a very stable region. We're never going to see war again. That's not the view in Korea, right? It's an unstable region. At some point, there may be a conflict. But we shouldn't simply follow the US, even though we have the alliance. We should try to have our own voice. But what I noticed at the same time is that for many Koreans, the alliance itself was beneficial to have an independent voice in the region, but also beyond the region. It's seen as an enabler, right, of Korea. For example, now there are talks in Europe, and I've noticed here as well, should we expand the G7, make it a G7 plus and include Australia and Korea, right? So for many Koreans, the alliance with the US, if this comes to happen, that the G7 is de jure expanded, to a large extent it would be because the US would want to have one of its allies as part of this institution, right? So yes, you want to be independent, but you realize that one of the assets you have is this long-standing alliance. And there's broad agreement about this in Korea. Secondly, you have China, right? Now, from a Korean perspective, China is going to be there forever. It has been there for hundreds of years, millennia, depending when you consider the start of Korean history and Chinese history, right? And it will remain there long after Xi Jinping is gone, which is a point that many Koreans make today. We have to get along with China under Xi Jinping, because whoever comes next, China is going to be there, right? But interestingly, even going back to the 1980s, and then the 1990s, early 2000s, when the perception of China was different, it may integrate into the global economy, it may not challenge the institutions that we have, but many Koreans were worried, right, because of China's support for North Korea, as you can imagine, but also because they have their own security issues with China, but also because historically China has tried to influence Korean politics. So I find this very interesting as well, that you have this long-term trend of a neighbor you want to get along with, but you have awareness towards how much you can do with it, right? And the third point relates obviously to North Korea. And something that I find very interesting is that talking to policymakers about how they see North Korea and relations with North Korea, they don't disagree much. They do emphasize different aspects. Some administrations emphasize more the deterrence of North Korea aspect. Some others emphasize the dialogue with North Korea aspect, right? but they don't fundamentally disagree that you need both. So you have this that refers to the region itself, right? And I say this because in the book I explained that there are 4 concentric circles in which South Korea, this has been recorded, right? So anyway, South Korea develops its grand strategy. You can cut it out, right? And the first one is obviously the triangular relationship between North Korea, US, and China. But starting with this, you also have East Asia, right? That's another concentric circle in which Korea develops its grand strategy. Then you have Eurasia and what we call today the Indo-Pacific, in the past maybe the Asia-Pacific, and then you have global institutions, right? So the way Korea sees these 3 different aspects of its grand strategy determines really how it sees the rest of its grand strategy. And I again emphasize the importance of the US, right? It's very interesting to see that when you talk to Korean officials, they don't see the alliance right now as circumscribed to the Korean Peninsula. This is a global alliance, right? So for example, if we look at Korea's position in global institutions, United Nations, WTO, these different types of institutions, they understand how much it benefits to them to be seen, or to actually not to be seen, to working together with the US. But this takes me to the other point. This creates difficulties in your relationship with China that has a different view about those institutions, and obviously North Korea, a very different view as well. So that would be the starting point, right? And I, as I said, noticed this in the interviews, but also in the documents, which was good to see. Because then you say, okay, South Koreans see it this way. But then when talking to officials from other countries, when interviewing them, they did agree with this view as well. So that helped me to make the case more strongly. So in the book, I talk about the factors that explain Korea's grand strategy, and then I move beyond this security interest and relations with neighbors and the ally, and I focus on domestic factors. So one thing that I found very interesting is that democracy and being a democracy is fundamental to understand Korea's grand strategy today. They feel very proud about the transition to democracy in 1987-88, and they think it should be a cornerstone of their grand strategy. And the current administration has been very vocal about it, right? The Yoon administration has been very open about it, the importance of human rights, democracy, rule of law. Previous ones, sometimes they were more vocal, sometimes they were less vocal, but the underlying thinking, right, and I always make this case when it comes to Korea, that you have to look at what they do, not what they say, when it comes to the grand strategy, because sometimes they won't say things even though they are doing them. Among other reasons, because they don't want to have problems with China, which is right next door. But values is fundamental to Korea, as much as interest, you could argue, throughout this period in time. I also focus on another domestic factor, which is the fact that Korea is a market economy. And obviously in Northeast Asia, this is not as common as it is in other parts of the world. So that also matters for Korea, for example, when it comes to FTAs with other countries, which is part of its grand strategy. And then I also focus on identity. Going all the way back to 1988, so the first post-dictatorship presidency, government, you do see this big focus on we are a middle power. We're a middle power, but we're a middle power in Northeast Asia. Because in Europe, many countries consider themselves to be middle powers. But then in Europe right now, and even back then when we had the end of communism, most countries were democracies, market economies. But being a middle power in East Asia is very different. If you're a middle power democracy, you're one of the very few, actually, that is democratic as opposed to authoritarian or a full-scale dictatorships, for example, right? So this matters as well, that for a very long period of time, Korea has identified itself in this way, and also that there are not big debates internally about whether Korea is a middle power or a great power or a weak power anymore, right? No, we're a middle power, so we should act as such, right? And I'll explain later on why this matters. Then I focus on the goals that Korea wants to achieve, and what I find interesting is that all countries want security, all countries want economic growth, all countries to be recognized globally. But in the case of middle powers such as Korea, the point about autonomy hugely matters, right? Because Koreans feel that during the dictatorial years, because of the threat of North Korea, because of the alliance with the US, that they couldn't determine their own foreign and security policy. They simply follow what the US was asking them to do, and they had to focus on North Korea, right? By 1988, something clicks right after the transition, which means, okay, fine, the alliance with the US is fundamental. As you know, 90% of Koreans have a positive view of the alliance, so pretty much everyone in the country has a positive view of the alliance, but we also have to show how we can be independent from the alliance itself, with a big change coming obviously in 1991, when Korea is able to join the United Nations, and it actually has a voice in global institutions that until then it didn't have, right? And what you see at this point in time is that when Korean policymakers are thinking about, okay, we're trying to be autonomous, but what does this mean in practice, right? You see a huge focus on the factors that I was mentioning. Well, we should champion our transition to democracy. We should champion our economic development model, right, which includes a strong market component. But also, if we want autonomy, and this is the last point that I would make for this introductory part of the presentation, we also have to use all the tools that we have at our disposal. And this means, from a Korean perspective, obviously the military tools that Korea has, and we see this very clearly now with Russia, Ukraine, right? So Korea supporting Ukraine indirectly. It means obviously diplomacy as well. It means investment as well. So you see this thinking about all the way going back to the 1990s about, well, if you have a Korean firm investing in the US, in China, in Europe, this gives us some leverage, right? And you see it now here in the US with the IRA, but you see it in China as well, at least until recently. Now you see it in Europe, right? You may or may not have noticed, but European leader after European leader is traveling to Korea, and the first thing they do is they go to Pyeongtaek, to the famous Samsung factory, right, of semiconductors, because they want a factory in Europe as well, right? So using these tools that it has at its disposal. And what I mentioned in the case of Korea as well, and I said this morning when talking to students, right? I had always been very skeptical about soft power. I thought, yeah, it's a nice concept, but so what, right? And then I was proven wrong when conducting my research about Korean tools. Because not talking to Koreans, but talking to foreign diplomats that talk to Korea, that have to deal with Korea, that have to negotiate with Korea, they actually say, well, soft power hugely matters, right? Because personally, right, we have an affinity for Korea that maybe was not there before. Because we didn't know the country, right? We knew it existed, but we didn't really know much about it, right? But the first impression we got is, oh, this music we like, this drama we like, these movies we like, or that our kids like. I mean, I heard this very often actually at King's back in London. Every year we get diplomats from Southeast Asia, from Thailand, from different countries that come to study with us for a master's degree, right? And I talk to them and they say, oh yeah, Korean culture, we love it where we are. And this actually helps Koreans because it's a very nice entry point for them, right? It's very different, for example, from North Korea, which is known for the nuclear weapons and human rights abuses. And Korea very quickly, from the 1990s onwards, realized that, oh, this is something that we can use as well, right? So it has this holistic approach towards its grand strategy, which has to use everything that it has at its disposal, right? If we look at the great powers, if we look at the US, with some countries, even the US military might is enough to shape the politics of that country, right? Because it's the most powerful military in the world, but that is not the case for Korea, clearly, right? So they have to use all this in my view, in a very clever way. And I'm going to transition to different regions which I focus on. I start with, as I said, with this triangular core, as I call it, which is North Korea, US, and China, right? And the point that I make, this is before even the current administration, is first of all, I just explained this, that US is fundamental to understand Korean grand strategy. This is not going to go away. But then what about China and North Korea, right? When it comes to China, as I said, I don't think it's new, this wariness towards the neighbor. You have it all the way back to the 1980s. Now, what happened, though, is that in the past, at least in public, Koreans would say, well, let's simply benefit from China's economic growth because it's next door to us, right? So that's the obvious thing to say in public. But when you talk to military officials, when you talk to government officials from different administrations, you always saw in private this thinking that, yes, but we cannot fully trust Beijing. Very clear with Xi Jinping, but even before Xi Jinping came to office. And with North Korea, as I explained, right? Yes, we have to get along with North Korea, and our ultimate goal, at least in theory, is going to be reunification. But at the same time, and this was even before it became nuclear, but obviously more so after it conducted the first nuclear test in 2006, we have to be ready, not necessarily for a war, but we have to be ready to this aggressiveness, provocations that come from North Korea. So a fairly consistent view over time. And I would say the same, right? I'm not American, so I studied the alliance not from any personal perspective, right? More from an academic or policy perspective as someone who is not from any of the two countries. But it's very interesting to see this dynamic because in Europe we have our own alliance with the US. Obviously, we have NATO, right? And Spain has very good security relations with the US as well. But you can actually see how in Korea this is more fundamental to the thinking about their place in the world than it is in other places. And I think that's important as well, because yes, many countries have alliances with the US, good relations, but how fundamental is it to the way of thinking? And in the case of Korea, it's really fundamental. I can really see the difference to when you talk to different countries in Europe, right? Then I move on to East Asia. Considering Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and obviously the big question here is Japan, for obvious reasons. Is the neighbor next door. And the point that I make is that once Korea became a democracy and it realized it is in a region in which, unlike Europe, there is not going to be a transition to democracy across the continent, who can you get along with, right? And yes, there are political problems with Japan, that's obvious, and I make the case that this will continue. I come from Spain, right? So we colonized most of Latin America, right? And 200 years after these countries became independent, we still have sometimes problems with them, right? So AMLO, the current Mexican president, for example, he's asking Spain for reparations, right? So I make the point, this is never going to disappear in the case of Korea, because Koreans always ask, do you think we'll always have problems with Japan? I say, well, yes, but they can be big problems, or it can be, we do have problems, so we have to get along, which is where Spain is with Latin American countries, right? That even when they criticize Spain, they say, well, we have to get along, right? You see it in other European countries. You see it with India and the UK, for example, because India is raising the same issues. Congo and Belgium, for example, Congo raising the same issues. So this is not unique to Northeast Asia. And what you notice is a willingness to work together with Japan, and going all the way back to the Clinton administration, the importance of the trilateral. As you all know, it's not new, right? The trilateral started with the Clinton administration and then continued. It's true that some presidents, obviously President Trump, for example, didn't feel strongly that this was beneficial to the US. And obviously Moon and Abe, the Korean and Japanese leaders, didn't get along at a personal level. But you still saw a degree of cooperation continuing, even if they didn't make it public, right? Because for domestic political purposes, it didn't really make sense for them to do so. Very differently for Jun, he's been very open about it, as well as Kishida, right? He's been very open about it, and obviously Biden here in the US as well. But I do make the point that this is something that Korean administrations feel they need to do because of the environment in which they are. If you don't get along with Japan, who are you going to get along in this part of the world, right? And I think this will continue. Because one of the questions we have today, how long is Camp David going to last? I think from a Korean perspective, it will outlast the current president because they do see the benefits of doing so, right? I also discuss Southeast Asia and the growing importance of Southeast Asia for Korea. And the point that I make, not only about Southeast Asia, but also about other parts of the world in which I will talk about in a second, is that if you look at Korean grand strategy, its entry point when it comes to many of these regions is economics, trade, investment, plus increasingly soft power, right? So Korean cultural centers, Sejong institutes to teach the language, this affinity that I mentioned for Korean cultural products. But it's not only focused on economics and culture to an extent anymore. That increasingly has moved into politics and security, right? And I make the point that this comes as much because of South Korea having an interest in this type of cooperation as the increasing demand that you see on Korea to deliver. That when Koreans say, Korean policymakers, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of National Defense say, oh, sorry, we can only focus on North Korea, that other countries don't buy this argument anymore. It's like, no, sorry, you have to do more than simply North Korea. In Europe now, very obvious with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? Before it existed, but now it's much more obvious. But in Southeast Asia, the security relationship between Korea and Southeast Asia, different countries, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, Philippines, right? It has been a long-term relationship, not only because Korea wants this, but because countries in the region say, we want to cooperate more with you in this area. And interestingly, and I guess, again, this goes back to the point that I made, you have to focus on what Korea does, right, and what it says, very much focus on China, right? And this is understood by countries in Southeast Asia, it's very much understood in Korea. They won't say it publicly because they don't want to say, they don't want to tell China, we're doing this because we don't trust you, but they will do it, right? And in private, they're actually quite open about it. I focus on this part of the world as well, and then I focus on, I move on to what I call Eurasia, Greater Eurasia and the Indian Ocean, which today we call the Indo-Pacific. For Korea, this focus on this part of the world is not new. The whole Eurasia idea goes all the way from Portugal and Spain on one side all the way to Korea, Japan and Russia's Far East on the other side. Again, it started because of economics, right? But increasingly you see the security angle. And here I'm going to focus a little bit more in Europe, since I come from the region, to explain how the thinking has changed in Europe more so than in Korea, right? From a Korean perspective, there were always the obvious economic opportunities, this being one of the wealthiest continents in the world, the European Union being one of the biggest markets in the world. But from a Korean perspective, things like the Russia-North Korea relationship always matter. Also, what may Europe do in security terms in the region? What interest might Europe have, especially when China became more threatening from the perspective of European countries, not only from the perspective of the countries in the region? And I make this point in the book that yes, economics is certainly the entry point. Soft power matters hugely, but you have to think beyond that, because Koreans think beyond that when it comes to the relationship with other parts of the world, not only with the countries in the region. And I make the same point about the demand side, right? So if we focus on Europe, and let's leave aside for a second the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Why would there be an interest when it comes to security cooperation with Korea? So for example, a big issue for us for a long period of time has been cybersecurity, right? So which countries are launching cyber attacks on European countries? China, Russia, and North Korea. So we have to talk to South Korea. What is your experience in dealing with cyber attacks from North Korea or from China or from Russia as well? See issues such as maritime security. I mean, I'm sure you all know, but the most transited commercial route in the world, maritime commercial route in the world, goes from East Asia to Europe, right? So you have to make this route safe. For example, with the piracy that we continue to see off the coast of Somalia, for example, in the Gulf of Aden, that part of the world. So yes, this might not make the headlines, and it's something we discussed this morning with the student group, right? A news story about, well, they're fighting piracy in the Gulf of Aden doesn't really sell much. North Korean nuclear tests, oh, that sells a lot, right? We're interested in that. Human rights abuses, we're interested in that. Camp David, we're interested in that, right? But there's this type of cooperation that is long-standing, that it won't stop regardless of who is president in Korea and regardless of who are the leaders of Europe, because there's a mutual interest, because values are shared, which makes cooperation easier with Korea. So we have to look into that. And it's fair to say that I make this case. It's true that when the reviews of the book come out, most people focus on US, China, North Korea, right? For good reason, Japan now. But I said, look, you have to look at this to understand Korea's long-term thinking, right? And again, I'm going to go back to the point about why the US matters. Well, it matters because the US is a strong, it's through NATO, it's the strongest ally that we have in Europe. It has the alliance with Korea. So for Korea, again, this is an enabler, right? It enables cooperation, it makes cooperation easier. Now, for example, the European Union is about to sign a security and defense partnership with Korea. It's under discussion right now. The other one in Asia will be with Japan, right? So from a European perspective, obviously, if you discuss security and defense with Korea, you're discussing security and defense with the alliance, right? Because of the integration that exists between the US and Korea, right? So again, this is an enabler for Korea to start its discussions, in this case with the European Union. If you look at NATO AP4, right? So 3 of those countries, right? Australia, Japan, Korea, their allies have a strong relationship with the US. So this matters hugely and as well. And the final region that I look at before the conclusion, so we have enough time for the Q&A, is what I call rest of the world and global governance. It's not very academic, saying, oh, the rest of the world. But anyway, that's where we are. And I prefer it to global south, I have to say, so the rest of the world and global governance. And here what you find, which is very interesting from my perspective, is that Korea has always been thinking about other parts of the world, your relationship with Latin America, with Sub-Saharan Africa. But during the Cold War, this was very much focused on diplomatic competition with North Korea. I wouldn't say it was strategic. It was more about how many countries we can have diplomatic relations with, so they don't have diplomatic relations with North Korea. But this changed after Korea joined the United Nations, and this changed actually as a result of Korea's economic power, right? And how different parts of the world, they do want this Korean investment, they want to trade with Korea. And I explained that what I find interesting at this rest of the world and global governance is that from a Korean perspective, economics is the main driver of this relationship. But again, the focus shouldn't only be on economics. It may be different type of security when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa, when it comes to Latin America, right? When I talk about different type of security, maybe human security in some cases, right? Not hardcore security like you have in Northeast Asia, right? It may be about cybersecurity, as I explained, because countries in Latin America, for example, sometimes they do suffer cyber attacks from North Korea. So they want to learn more from the South Korean experience about dealing with North Korean cyber attacks, right? So it's this holistic interpretation of security. Now, obviously, you would also include economic security that has been driving Korean grand strategy towards this part of the world. So we have to think beyond the usual suspects of economic relations, and obviously I refer to this again, soft power, right? So I get this example in talks, right? In 2003, when I was living in Korea, I had a very good friend from Panama who was very interested in Korean culture. So I said, I understand Korean culture, because family relations, the role of hierarchy, position of women. I understand it. It's very similar to Panama, Latin America, right? In Spain, in Europe back then, Korean culture wasn't very big as it is today, right? So you have to think about this. I explained this. You have to think about this as well. That soft power matters with many different parts of the world, but it's not the end point. But even in regions in which you think soft power, what role does it play? You actually have to realize that it does play an important role in Korean grand strategy. And I'll have 5 more minutes, I think it is. So the two final points. Academics, we always have to ask the question, so what, right? Yeah, fine, Korea has a grand strategy, so why should we care, right? The first point that I make is, well, we should care because most countries in the world, they are not the US and they're not China. They're not superpowers. They are middle powers, so in some cases, they would call themselves weak powers, right? So we have to understand how these countries, taking a more holistic approach, not only focus on Korea, how these countries try to project power to other parts of the world, and how they try to have an independent grand strategy, making their own destiny, as I explained, as I have in the subtitle of my book. Because even if you are the US or China, you have to interact with these countries. So you have to understand where are they coming from. So that's the first point that I make, that, and make it in the introduction, but also towards the end. We should be looking at more and more middle powers, right? What is their grand strategy, because we'll have to interact with them, and also because other countries may be able to learn, or if not to learn, at the very least to understand how fellow middle powers approach global affairs. Second point that I make, we have to understand that not only the case of Korea, but again, I made this point about middle powers in general, they are capable of thinking long term. And sometimes in the literature, but also when you talk to policymakers, they think, well, they simply have to respond to whatever is out there, right? So if the US is doing A, countries will have to do A. If China is doing B, countries will have to do B. But the point that I make is like, well, of course they will be constrained by the international structure, right? And they will have to pay attention to what these big powers are doing, right? I mean, in Europe, we do think about the EU as an economic superpower, and it's true that when you talk to other countries, they do say, yeah, we are constrained, obviously, by EU economic policy. But we have to understand that this doesn't mean that they cannot think about, okay, what is my long-term system, and how can I get to achieve my long-term goals in spite of the constraints that I actually suffer in my thinking, but also in my actions.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.